friends and colleagues, to CG webinar seminar number 276. And today, in 60 minutes, we're going to take you through 400 years of the history of Chilean universities. Chile is a country which gets a lot of its global attention, and we've talked about Chile before with Pete Leihy, who's our presenter today. I'll introduce him in a moment, but first let me take you through the webinar protocols. Now, you will recall, if you've been here before, that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website, and that is a route to YouTube, our channel on YouTube, within 48 hours or so. You'll also be able to see on our website a copy of the chat function from today's discussion. Now, during the webinar, please keep yourself muted. Extraneous noise coming from your own location can disrupt the webinar. And we also like you to turn off your camera during the speakers speaking and during the Q&A until it's your turn to come in. We recommend using speaker view in the top right-hand corner there in red, so you can more clearly see who is talking during the webinar. Now, to develop a role in the Q&A, to ask a question or to make a statement, put your ideas or your questions into the chat, and I will select participants in the Q&A from what's coming in. I need to see something in the chat, otherwise I don't know that you would like to speak. That's your way in. So if you come in relatively early, towards the end of Pete's presentation or in the next 10-15 minutes, you should get into the Q&A discussion, providing your comment or your question are relevant to the topic of the webinar. If you come in the last 5 or 10 minutes, there's a chance you might miss out because we'll have a full speaking list by then. When you're invited into the Q&A, and I will send you a private message in the chat saying we're going to bring you in. When you're invited in by me through the sound, you then turn on your camera and turn off your mute so we can hear you, and then announce who you are, where you're from. Pete Leihy is a research professor at Universidad Andrés Bello in Santiago, capital city of Chile, great city of 8 million, I think. It nestles under the Andes, a very spectacular and beautiful location. He advises on and studies higher education around the world. He was originally from Melbourne, where I confess I helped to supervise his PhD, successful PhD at the University of Melbourne. He's been in Chile for a few years. He likes history and philosophy. He is very interested in Chilean higher education itself and knows a lot about it. We're about to hear some of that today. Pete, the screen is yours.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Simon. I will share my presentation. Share. And I will put it on.
Good, we can see that.
That's on slideshow. Excellent. Excellent. Well, privateers, 400 years of the Chilean University, 1622 to 2022. Chile's got a new government coming in tomorrow, and the new president, Gabriel Boric, originally made his name as a student activist. He was a leader of Universidad de Chile's Law Student Society during an enthusiastic student strike in 2009. Protests would really peak nationally in 2011. If anyone reads Spanish, there's a wonderful book about the law school strike called La Escuela Tomada, Overtaken School, by the irascible writer Alfredo Jocelyn Holt, whom I'll mention later. Back then, the big rolling triad of the protest sloganeering was Educación Pública Gratuita y de Calidad, which can be understood at least two ways. One is that public education should be fee-free and good quality, Another is that all education should be public, fee-free, and good quality. Historically, this second reading is more in keeping with the tradition in Spanish of saying that education should be a set of three good things. If I do write this up as a paper, I'll provide some sources on that and other finer points. In higher education, the policy response to such demands has seen made available leanly state-funded places for students from less wealthy backgrounds, as well as the ever greater prominence of quality assurance. Boric's incoming government has student debt forgiveness as an official agenda item, but his Treasury has already made it clear that non-regressiveness principles will again apply. And of course, the economy isn't looking great for anyone, anywhere. There has been a lot of effort put into considering what's public about higher education in Chile, which expanded from the late 1980s through student fees and student loans. And we have also seen often insightful work on what's private about Chilean higher education. The doyen of Chilean higher education commentary, Jose Joaquin Bruna, introduced the 1970s Habermasian concept of privatism, I think even by the end of the 1970s, to project what has been, I guess in the end, the financialization of the Chileans in various aspects of life. Of course, in the study of higher education, expansion has been really a key frontier as higher education gets bigger. And in order to help it get bigger, we ponder whether and how much to build through fees and how much and what to subsidize with public money. And I think worldwide, from the middle of last century, we have noticed general patterns in qualitative changes as we go from elite only to mass to universal access, and perhaps curb our enthusiasm and then describe different high participation configurations, as Simon Marginson has covered. But if we're going to look back over 4 centuries, we could probably venture a different way of thinking. Sorry, just getting things in order. When we're talking about higher education operations in given places over time, I think it's useful to consider their magnitude, how big they are and have been, and also what I would call their plenitude, how fully they inform society, as it were. So magnitude and plenitude. Now, the magnitude I'd like to think of as an essentially private component. It is made up of people learning and discovering and imparting and recognizing each other. It is ultimately the individuals and their circumstances. And plenitude, that's a public perspective. How is this affecting a society? I'm going to talk through 4 rough centuries of Chilean universities. And as I go, to summarize each, I'll consider magnitude and plenitude. Now, in the advertising material, which was very successful, I might add, I mention the figure of the privateer, like Francis Drake. Spanish colonial Chile had a periodic fear of enterprising English and Dutch pirates coming and messing things up, or even establishing their own settlements. But in being a global pirate like Francis Drake, the privateer was doing a public service for his country. His queen, Elizabeth, was actually a private investor with him, but then again, she was also considered a major heretic by the Spanish, which was a rather public role. So in piracy, as in higher education, private enterprises make for public gain, sometimes at someone else's expense. There's been, here we have an image of Francisco Draco desecrating the church in the port of Valparaíso when he couldn't find anything worth stealing. Perhaps it's a long bow to draw, but since in higher education studies, we're always trying to transpose comparative education concepts originally conceived to compare US state systems, and the flagship university is one of those. To my mind, the university as privateer somehow better matches the range of enterprising institutions that Chile has had and has. I've got 4 themed centuries of the Chilean university to cover. I like centuries and decades because they provide a common point of reference, albeit perhaps self-perpetuating for imagining times and places. And serendipitously, around the 20s of each of these centuries, you can see some nice breaks. It's magic. First, Flanders of the Indies, then what I'll call the century of grain, then the weight of the night, and finally, Chile is its people, the last 100 years. And I'll explain those terms as we come to them. Here, I have to be fairly selective or arbitrary about what to cover, but if anyone has a favorite Chilean university or favorite part of Chilean history, you could ask me about it and I'll tell you what I think. Chilean universities are good fun. So we begin the first century in 1622, when the first university in the Spanish Captaincy General, a second-tier colony of Chile, flourishes. Approved by the Pope, no less. It's a small, theologically oriented collective that never has more than a few dozen members, run by the Dominican order. And it is named after their great intellectual hero, Pontificia Universidad de Santo Tomás de Aquino, the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. Quite a few colonial universities were named after Thomas Aquinas, not least the first university in the Americas in Santo Domingo, in today's Dominican Republic, and the first thing called a university in Asia, in Manila. In 1622, the Bishop of Santiago, who had been a Franciscan friar himself, also unsuccessfully tried to organize another university, implying in his arguments that the new Dominican university was not really a university, like more major ones in the vice-regal capitals such as Lima and Mexico City, but he wasn't successful. Also, hot on the heels of the Dominican establishment came another small university opened in 1626, this time run by the Jesuits. An interesting thing about the Jesuits is that they'd only really come into the service of the Spanish Empire relatively recently, from the 1580s. Prior to that, in their earliest decades, the Jesuits had been very successful missionaries in Africa and Asia for the Portuguese trading empire. The early Jesuits were largely Basque from both sides of the Pyrenees, and Basque is a strange non-Indo-European language, and it follows that they were particularly good at learning newly encountered languages. The Spanish royals preferred not to trust the Jesuits, being on the border and over the border with France, but in 1580, Spain and Portugal had entered into personal union under Felipe II of Spain and then Portugal. And Jesuits were increasingly sent to the Americas, essentially to evangelize by learning local languages. For those of you who enjoy your Southern theory, and we all do, it's interesting to note that Chilean universities, first in Santiago, and later in Concepcion, further to the south, would be the furthest south universities had been in the world until Simon Marginson's glorious alma mater, the University of Melbourne, was founded in the new British colony of Victoria in the 1850s. Here's a rather aspirational map of Chile at the turn into the 19th century. Now, I'm not a trained cartographer, but in reality, in the 17th century, effective control looked something more like this. Try as they might to bring in indigenous groups into the colonial fold, the missionaries, like the conquistadores before them, failed. And in fact, central Chile's holdout indigenous people would actually invade much of what is now southern Argentina and Chilean Patagonia. On this map, on the original map, you would believe that this was part of the Chilean colony, and it was not. I don't know to what being southernmost entitles a place conceptually, but it is of course interesting to note that in Europe, really dynamic academia was at this time moving north in anticipation of and arguably kindling early modernity, there more than in the historically more fecund Mediterranean centres. So more temperate climate, higher quality thought. I'm just throwing it out there in celebration of Chilean colonial universities, about whose activities actually we have only very scrappy records. From the 1600s was a time in which Spain, the early 1600s was a time in which Spain was fighting a kind of holy war against the Dutch Republic and wasting a lot of the riches of its colonies, including Portugal's. This was a romantic sort of war, the 80 Years' War, very, very brutal. Now, in the historiography of the Spanish Empire, we identify what we retrospectively call the Black Legend, la leyenda negra. This is a way of categorizing the characterization of Spain as a particularly cruel and rapacious power with a lot of material generated in the Netherlands and Britain and the Protestant parts of Germany, propaganda basically. Woodcut technology and printing were very important there, spreading images of the demonic practices of the Spanish abroad. Chile was not a terribly successful Spanish colony. It did not deliver the riches of some other places. And in reality, the Spanish never committed great military resources to conquer resistant and truculent parts of the indigenous population. By way of publicity and perhaps apologetics for not being able to conquer all the territory, several contemporary Spanish texts romanticize Chile as the Flanders of the Indies. So like the Spanish Netherlands, where the Spanish were fighting the Dutch, clashing in glorious and gory ways with their worthy native adversaries. For example, the great poem about the early Spanish conquest attempt and local resistance, La Araucana, was actually mentioned in the novel Don Quixote, which is quite a fillip. In any case, both the Dominican and the Jesuits do their best at evangelism and pastoral care, but these universities remain rather boutique operations. A bit of Black legend bleeds into the way Spanish universities are sometimes imagined as these sort of proto-totalitarian nerve centers for indoctrination and censorship and tight scholasticism and so on. Now in Chile, denominational tensions and scheming are palpable, but in reality, these operations were small indeed, with little magnitude and limited plenitude. Now, whatever we can infer about the academic performance of the civilizing and evangelical work in that first century, one thing is for sure. Some of the good people of Santiago were not satisfied and they wanted another kind of university along the lines of that proposed by the bishop a century earlier. So with all the major faculties, a law faculty and a faculty of medicine and mathematics. So here we're looking at the early 18th century. It should be noted that in 1724, the Jesuits succeeded in setting up a small university in Concepcion. The Jesuits, you can see it there on that map, were very enthusiastic about converting the indomitable indigenous people who around this time first appear in Jesuit records under the name Mapuche, which means the people of the land in their own language. Now, the observant among you may note that the people of the land is a class of people in the Bible, in the early rabbinic writings, haaretz in Hebrew. The people of the land being the people who live outside the cities and towns and don't listen to the rabbis. So it may be that the name Mapuche is a kind of affectionate Jesuit analogy between the evangelism resistant Mapuche and the biblical people of the land, the idea being of the ones that got away from the colonizing project. The Jesuits are generally struggling in this period in the Spanish Empire. The Bourbon regime, which began in 1700 under Felipe V, who had been a French prince, does not trust the Jesuits, even less than before. The Bourbons work on what are retrospectively called the Bourbon Reforms. I've called this period the century of grain. Century of wheat is used in Chilean historiography to describe this period when Chile started shipping wheat around the Viceroyalty of Peru. But I've ingeniously gone with grain to remind us of Bourbon on a subliminal level. The Bourbon Reforms, which sought modernization, are variously portrayed as a dead cat bounce of the idea of a mighty empire, or that many of the antecedents, that is to say, of the future Hispanic American republics were sown in this time. We're not sure how much reform went on under the Bourbon Reforms. Both of those ideas have their charm. So the boosters of the proposed new and more comprehensive University for Santiago want to serve basically the southern cone of the continent, including places way to the other side of the rather imposing Andes Mountains, and getting right up into the subtropical areas towards the top of that beautiful map. Of course, at this time, it was still quite treacherous to pass around Tierra del Fuego in ship or through the channels. Now, this was remarkable for two surely not coincidental reasons. One, in 1613, a very good university had been established in today's Argentina, in Cordoba. The buildings are still there, and the university at Cordoba was run by the Jesuits. What do you know? In Santiago, the Jesuits are excluded from the new university that is established, which in 1747 is finally inaugurated with the name real, not pontifical, Universidad de San Felipe. Has the same name as the recently deceased and long-reigning Felipe V. The subsequent Bourbons intensified their distrust of the Jesuits and their general loyalty to the Pope, and eventually Felipe's son Carlos III famously expels the Jesuits from the Spanish realms in 1767. Now, the remarkable thing about the proposition of serving far-slung areas over the mountains, when there's a perfectly good university at Cordoba, is that it actually happens. The new university in Santiago attracts students from places such as Buenos Aires and the interior of what is now Argentina, even from Lima, which obviously has a very long-standing university. And in fact, some of the lawyers who come from Buenos Aires and are trained in Santiago become important figures in the independence process and prior to it in Argentina. At the same time, the Real Universidad de San Felipe is never terribly large and averages around a dozen graduates a year. So modest magnitude, but like grain, its influence is sown around, and I think it does offer a sense of plenitude as a factor in colonial and indeed Republican life. Now we come into the 19th century and independence, which happened in the 1810s in Chile. We eventually get the replacement of the old university with a new one, and a kind of Chilean catchphrase, the weight of the night, very much informs this. The weight of the night is the description from the rather governability-minded politician, Diego Portales, who saw a dire shortage of educated people in the new republic and stressed the importance of delivering order over the benighted masses. Now, the point I want to make here has to do with another conservative hero of the Republic's organization, the founding rector of Universidad de Chile, Andrés Bello. Universidad de Chile essentially replaced the Universidad de San Felipe in the early 1840s. Now, it's difficult to convey how much of a cult there is around Andrés Bello. He's a national hero in Chile. He's also a national hero in his native Venezuela. There's a very good Catholic university named after him there. And he was a Venezuelan who was recruited from Europe. First he was in London, then he was in Spain. by Chilean conservatives as the conservatives were about to achieve an iron-like grip on power in 1830, and Bello would get a lot of things done. He wrote the Civil Code, he was a spelling and grammar reformer, he was a senator, and of course he was at least the front person for the reorganized university. One biography calls him the true founder of Chile, and I've acquired a new and admittedly niche hobby of noting down instances ever since where the founding of Universidad de Chile is noted as one of the very greatest achievements during the Republic's first century. In many ways, the cult of Bello is a kind of flip side to any Black legend notion of the Spanish Empire as this sort of proto-totalitarian thought control sort of place. The Republican Universidad de Chile is held up as the apotheosis of reason and truth. And of course, actually, there's a lot of continuity with the previous university, and the university would grow gradually and solidly to the extent that there is still pride in the centrality and plenitude of Universidad de Chile's tradition today. I think actually this has something to do with its never having giganticized fully, which is a word that you see used to discuss many Hispanic universities in particular. For example, it was used in the discussion of how to expand Spanish higher education during the 1960s, towards the end of the Franco years. So the autonomas in Barcelona and in Madrid and Universidad del País Vasco were created mindful of the need not to have massive, massive universities. Whereas in Buenos Aires and Montevideo in Uruguay and Mexico City, we have these huge all-comers institutions. Universidad de Chile's size has always been relatively manageable. And also, it didn't hold on to its 20th century regional expansion campuses very long, and those became regional universities in their own right in the 1980s. I feel that the privateer metaphor draws together not only the weight of the night catchphrase, the paternalistic but proactive elite, but really a repeated thread in Chilean history, wherein it is hard to tell the difference between well-organized institutions and circles of privileged individuals. There's a lot of meditation on that theme, including Alfredo Jocelyn Holt's study called El Peso de la Noche. You can see it there with the Diego Portales' face on it. And also the magnum opus of Sol Serrano called Universidad y Nación, University and Nation, Chile in the 19th century. Serrano prefaces her study on the university and its relationship with Chile's general institutionality, saying she had wanted to apply the historical technique of prosopography, which is where you try and create a picture of a social circle based on whatever information you can collect about individuals. It's often used to try and recreate a sense of time. But she felt that she couldn't get enough data to do this. She did her doctorate at Oxford, actually. That's where that project happened. Anyway, I do think that part of the cult of the institutional personality of Universidad de Chile does lie there, in the relatively modest magnitude of the institution somehow being recognized as a benign rationalizing force. I could go into some other university traditions, the technical university tradition and the establishment of Santiago's Catholic University, the first successful example created in a Latin American republic. If anyone's interested in that, ask a question. So we come into the 20th century. After the First World War, which Chile did not join, but did fuel with certain commodities. Now, I use the label Chile is its people here because this phrase has cropped up a lot over the last 100 years. Chile is its people is a rather double-edged sword. Perhaps the most obvious way to read it is to think, well, all our potential is there in the people. we have to love them and help them. And another is, well, Chile is its people. No wonder they treat each other so unfairly. The place is full of Chileans. I can't trace when Chile is its people arose, but it seems to become more common during the 20th century. Here's a poster from a North Korean-backed Communist Party offshoot. Now, it's important to note that Chile's neighbor Argentina became the first Latin American country to adopt democracy, or full democracy, at least with compulsory manhood suffrage during the 1910s. Mind you, beginning in 1930, Argentina has suffered almost relentlessly terrible governments, including several very brutal military governments, and it's no role model today. Now, Chile would not see full suffrage until the 1960s. And the reason for introducing it then was the hope of strengthening the role and steering power of the president, so a meaningful program could be carried out. But what Chile did see from 1919 was a much heightened aesthetic of appealing to the populace, including modest progress legislating towards wider education, mostly primary education. Not unlike the weight of the night, it is possible to imagine Chile is its people as a kind of human capital theory avant la lettre. And over the last 100 years, wider higher education has been progressively recognized as a goal. And the number of Chilean universities and their levels of autonomy and their public funding would increase through the middle part of last century. If you go back to the start of living memory, it might have been possible to imagine education as in a race with populism, because perhaps even credentialization provides at least a propulsive stake in society. But as it turns out, I think education is not in a race, but rather a beauty contest with populism. And to the extent that they model a kind of downscaled politics, there is an ongoing demand for universities to generate innovative notions of cultural development. Now, just a final major point I want to make about the growth of Chilean higher education, particularly over the last 30 or so years, which in general terms was covered in great statistical detail in a previous CGHE seminar I did a year ago with Jose Miguel Salazar and Elizabeth Simburger, called What's Spanish for Development? Look it up, obviously. And the most specific point I want to make, and the more specific point I want to make, is about feminization and the qualitative change it brings. As in many places, first, the student body has feminized in different parts of the university. Some of them are less feminine still, engineering, for example. Overall, the professoriate is on that trajectory too. It's feminizing and is reaching parity, and we'll shoot ahead. But there is some lag for senior leadership posts. And of course, that's an international experience. To the extent that they seem to represent a kind of vanguard of political foment, there is historically a rather macho component in Chilean university politics. In Chile's state universities, through the election of rectors by academics, other employees and students, we have very few instances of female rectors on record. In fact, the first one was just about 4 years ago, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, actually elected. I could go into some of the earliest female rectors in Chile during the 1980s, none of them elected through representative governance. And in fact, one of them was the brilliant and strong-willed cousin of Chile's longtime military dictator and guardian fave, Augusto Pinochet, his younger cousin and two-time cabinet minister, Monica Madriaga, would actually become the first rector of my institution, Universidad Andrés Bello, in 1988. And she was famous for criticizing the regime she had worked for and asking forgiveness for its atrocities, or rather apologizing for them. Now, as you'd notice in Britain or elsewhere, apologizing in Chilean public life has become part of the retail political skill set over the last few years. And the incoming President Boric is really good at it. He does a great apology. In any case, there is a sense right now that not only are we going to see more female university heads, but that we need to see them. And you can say being rector is not the be all and end all, and that gender balance is not the ultimate bellwether of political climates. But of course, all around the world, our belated concern that many universities have never had a female head is being addressed. This year, many Chilean universities are holding leadership elections, and not only the sense of breaking through a glass ceiling, but also really crying out for somehow a sea change in institutional culture is felt, and it's sincerely felt. I think it's neither pat nor controversial to note that often women's leadership draws more on flowing reserves of emotional intelligence than entrenched male-dominated traditions. I don't think that's controversial to say. In fact, it is basically a competitive imperative for the renewal of many institutions to bring in more female leadership. I don't think it's possible to unpick today's problems by searching the past, especially 400 years of the past. It's impossible to identify. It is possible, on the other hand, to identify and perhaps even seek redemption for blind spots and injustices over that time. Chile is its people, and there is a dire need for a more sophisticated understanding of the past, where we don't imagine each other as on the wrong or the right side of history, and instead value and build on the opportunities we have for ourselves and for one another. Chilean higher education today has lots of magnitude. I think about almost 8% of the Chileans are university students as we speak. Chilean higher education today, university and higher education students, Chilean higher education today has lots of magnitude, with lots of people seeking knowledge and opportunities through it. And universities do promise a sense of greater intellectual plenitude, of course, alongside technological prosthesis that variously frees us up from and corrals us into routines. So that's something to think about. There remains quite a lot of work to do in terms of perceived fairness, but again, Chile is its people, and they are capable of getting better at talking to and understanding one another from here. And that's the end of my presentation.
Many thanks, Pete. And rich in terms and phrases and images, as your presentations always are. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and then we'll move to our call list, which is beginning to emerge. This is a long kind of 4-part question, but it's actually one question and you'll recognize the question. So you'll have in your mind something of the answer already, I'm sure. Now, what makes Chilean culture distinctive within Latin America, and why is it distinctive? And what role has higher education played in that distinctiveness? And how has that distinctiveness affected Chilean higher education?
Yes, I think I got 3 of those. Has affected.
Well, I'll go through it again. Sorry to if you.
There's the third one. I need the third one.
Well, what makes Chilean culture distinctive within Latin America? Why is it distinctive? What role has higher education played in that distinctiveness, in producing and reproducing it? And how has that distinctiveness affected higher education?
Okay, thank you. So this is a very good question with 4 parts. Now, Chile is an isolated place. It's a very isolated place. Classically, we describe it as being a bit like an island. It's got the mountains up against it. It's got a desert to the north. It's got the Pacific Island. It's got the Pacific Ocean. And it was not a particularly wealthy colony at any point. It became a useful one because it had a temperate climate. So it was useful for producing food supplies for the more glamorous Lima to the north, where a lot of the extractionism, as people like to say, came from. And Chile did have a strong sense of isolation. Its natural population didn't expand very much during the colonial period. And in fact, during the Republican periods, the last 200 years, Chile actually hasn't received all that much immigration, certainly not compared to Argentina, Uruguay, the other side of the continent. So there is a strong sense that Chile is a distinct unit, kind of a natural country. And I know certainly around the world, you can argue that some territories are more natural units than others. So I think up until actually quite recently, there was a very strong sense of the Chilean people, sort of mixed people. Now we're going through a process where we're trying to find a new constitution to replace the military government era constitution of 1980. And people are really short on ideas. I mean, they're trying to borrow things from Peru and Bolivia. I'm not sure whether it's just a fad or whether it's going to work, but Chile is its own kind of country. It got its institutionalization in place very early, partly because of the early success of conservatives in the Republic. And it does have a strong sense of centralization historically, simply because it's so spread out. It's had to be centralized. Now, of course, there's talk of greater regionalization. Chile looks very naturally regional. It has all these regions stacked on top of one another, and we'll see what greater regionalization comes to mean. Of course, an aspect of the centralization is higher education. Half the students are in Santiago. Santiago has about 40% of the population. Half the students, more than half the universities are there. And perhaps more than any other Latin American state, it's a centralized state historically. Technocracy was recognized very early on, not with that word, of course, as being a valuable thing. And that's what I was talking about by the weight of the night. Technocracy remains very important. Technocracy, a few years ago, we'd say that technocracy was aligned with the neoliberalism. We like to complain about the neoliberalism. We've got a new government coming in that says it's not neoliberal, but seems to be perfectly technocratic. So maybe we'll call them technocratic instead of neoliberal. Chilean higher education has reflected its distinctiveness quite profoundly, I think, in the sense that as an isolated place, it's high stakes. The idea of getting the university right, and with the expansion of universities outside Santiago, getting the universities right over the 20th century was very important. The universities are distinctive by virtue of reflecting this tension between this centralizing urge and a natural diversity. And that's one of the things that I would say makes Chilean universities interesting. A lot of them have this very similar governance blueprint, at least in the public sector. And a lot of the private universities came into being at the same time from the 1980s with fairly similar models. So there's this tension between there being a kind of common sense of the center and the obvious existence of great diversity as well. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers the question. I mean, it's pretty sprawling. I think my answer was longer than your question, Simon, at least.
Thanks. Second question for me, and then we'll go to Glenn Chatelier after that. Chile has very highly developed sense of the public you know, in its education debate, as is shown by the way in which when left of centre candidates are in power or seeking power, issues related to access and free tuition and so on become very important. So you've got this, to make sure, traditional modern focus on the public and public good and universality of approach and so on. On the other hand, you've got this highly developed private sector approach. Large proportion of enrolments are in the private sector. Higher education's been a key side of neoliberal reform. You know, it seems to be very well developed in both respects, the public discourse and the private discourse, and both manifest politically or economically in some way. How is this going to be resolved?
Well, I think it can't be resolved. And the best analysis of the public and private stuff always considers both, not as a perfectly matched sort of complement of concepts, but these sort of infinitely overlapping ideas. This actually resonates with the origins of universities in Chile in these heavily scholastic religious institutions. You know, obviously the Dominicans were a scholastic order. Thomas Aquinas was the hero. The Jesuits had their own scholastic tradition. It's mostly based out of Coimbra, in their case, in Portugal. And there is a capacity to think the two things at the same time in the Chileans. And some of the best analysis I've seen on public and private in Chile actually comes from, well, foreigners. Foreigners resident in Chile. Manfred Svensson is I believe he's of Swedish extraction. He's Svensson with an O, I think. So I think that makes him Swedish. He's at the Opus Dei University in Santiago, which is called Los Andes, and he studies Aquinas and Martin Luther and others, and a lot of his analysis of the public and the private, reflecting really, I guess, natural law as reflected in the scholastic tradition, really resonates to me. Now, Chileans, obviously, that's a meta-narrative. It's a habitus, I suppose, in scholastic terms. It's people don't recognize that, but I think it is the key. And Chileans don't see it. Chileans don't see this interdependence between the public and the private naturally, but it is there. And the absolutist ideas of the public, I think, are known intellectually not to work. For example, Argentina is a famous example of this. Argentina has fee-free state undergraduate education in the state universities, in the national universities. So the national universities are terribly underfunded. They're chaotic. They're very private places because they have not autonomy, but autarky, autarky with the CH. They're self-ruling, and they're really intensely private places. But for reasons often pertaining to legal precedents, the idea that public means fee-free, for example, state-funded fees, is really entrenched in the Argentinian system. In Chile, there's a bit more versatility on that front, I think. I think people do value the empirical. They like to see non-regressiveness, for example. Nobody wants to see middle-class welfare, upper middle-class welfare in Chile. I don't know if that's answered your question satisfactorily. There are very, very grand announcements of the public in Chile, and the state universities are put upon, but it's not quite as simple as that, would be my answer.
Well, we'll see how it plays out in the new presidency. Now, I'd like to bring in two questions for you now, Pete, because we're, coming down to the last 10 minutes. So we might do our questions in brackets. So Glenn Chatelia will be followed by Jorge Gibbert as well. So first, Glenn.
Thanks, Simon. Pete, I enjoyed your presentation. And my question to you is, what would be the characteristics, if one were to bullet mark the characteristics of Chilean education, given the origins of the system as you've described them within the Catholic Church and in very traditional colonial influenced systems, and moving more into the 21st century, how much has the education system allowed a liberalization and yet held on to the traditionalism? Would you be able to reflect something about that, please? Thank you.
So hold your answer, Pete, and we'll bring in Jorge Gibbert at this point. Hello.
Okay. I'm going to. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your talk. Very interesting and informative from a historical point of view. I must confess that I like your similarity with privateurs, but I don't think that conceptually it applies fairly at limited periods of time. My question is more essentialist or deeper, if you like, and refers to whether we can think of a university as it is now in the central countries. I mean, Ivy League, Oxford, etc. Before the 90s in Chile. I think that just in those years, Chilean universities reached the level of universities in our proper sense, that is, universities with international research in a sufficient amount of papers. So I would like to know your opinion on that matter, the role of neoliberalism in the constitution of broad research universities that have shaped the current Chilean higher education system. Thank you.
Okay, so am I on? Hello? Great. Thank you for those questions. Now, Glenn, I think the continuity that I see in higher education really appeals to me in general. I like to see higher education as reflecting a kind of civil religion through time. And of course, a lot of the good studies of US higher education, which offers very good records right from the start, right from the 17th century, as opposed to other places that started, from nothing. Tracing the development of civil religion through time is probably the common thread that you can see between these very small institutions in the beginning and developing through time. Of course, the massification and expansion of opportunity is something that came very late everywhere in the world. You know, it's a post-Second World War thing. In the Chilean case, it's interesting. I think that there is a sense of a steady build-up of institutions of sufficiently good quality through time, and as such, the civil religion, the belief in opportunity, the belief in one another, even did build up steadily over time, and this segues into Jorge's question, actually, with the very rapid massification in Chile, which started right at the end of the 1980s. Chile was coming out of a big recession in the mid-1980s, obviously under the military government. When it came out of that recession, there was an explosion, initially a reasonably subtle explosion in the number of institutions and the number of students that just soared through the 90s. And this is something you see in a lot of countries more and more participation. Now, that belief was pumped up, and then it kind of exploded with some of the material that I was beginning with around 2009, 2011. There's a sense that the emperor is naked, or there's not enough opportunity coming out of this thing. Maybe there was a misunderstanding of what higher education was. Now, so that's a basic general answer to your question, Glenn, which is a very, very valid one. But civil religion is really interesting to me. Now, Jorge, yes, I agree that from the 1990s, I think Chile has done a good job of creating a more filigreed and robust research culture in particular. You know, the search for new knowledge and that sort of thing, publication, international connections than it had previously had. And of course, there was the rupture of the military government and exiles intervening there as well. And there has been a build-up with this, of course, at the same time as the academic capitalism conceit, so the narration of academic capitalism. If you see money moving around, there must be academic capitalism. I'm just about to publish a book chapter with my colleague Jose Miguel Salazar called Academic Careerism. And academic careerism is what we see, academic capitalism without the academic capital. And you see a bit of that happening in Chile, academic capitalism for the sake of academic capitalism. Now, in Chile, of course, it's very important to realize that universal primary education in Chile took a long time to actually fall into place. It was legislated, I think, in 1922, didn't actually fall into place for poorer Chileans until perhaps the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s. Secondary education, that wasn't happening until the 90s, universal access to upper secondary education. I think from 2005, we've had, it's been compulsory to finish secondary education, although what secondary education means today isn't what it used to mean 50 years ago, when if you did get an upper secondary education, you were getting something as good as an undergraduate education is these days. So Chile has done a good job, I think, of kind of building research. We probably have to put more effort into understanding our students. We use this term in Latin America. We often like to say the complex university, and this probably make more sense to you as a Spanish speaker. I like to say we don't have the complex university, but we do have the complicated university in Chile. Chileans are very complicated, and their culture is reflected in the university. And look, I think in the future, the university is going to get better and better in Chile. We probably won't see explosive growth from here, but we will see maturation. I hope that's a good enough answer. I know I'm taking up too much time.
Well, we've still got time for one more bracket of questions, and nice comments coming in praising your webinar in the chat, Pete. Now,
that's my mom.
Can we have Arpe Kaspari, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I would like to ask now, when this Bancada Estudiantil, so the former students' leaders, came into power, isn't it quite surprising that there is very little talk about higher education by them? They dominated the public discourse for almost 15 years or something like that. They were every day in the newspapers, and what is going to be expected from them now?
Now, before you answer that, Pete, let's bring in Gonzalo Donoso. Oh, no, Gonzalo's in hospital. He wants me to read his questions. I'll quickly go to it. How would you define higher education, public education in Chile, particularly through the discourse of universities such as Catholic universities? So this is referring to the ambiguity about the term public, which is created by the claims of the non-government sector that it's fulfilling public objectives.
Thank you. So that's Gonzalo and Afi. Okay, I mean, there's the cruel answer to this question, and that is that the student leaders don't know anything about higher education because they were protesting all the time. I think the technical side, that they will have very good advisors on the job. The president famously didn't finish his law degree. They will have very good advisors on the job coming in tomorrow. Higher education, well, there's not a lot of money for it, and the truth is, Chile, schooling is a much higher priority than higher education. I know that's a very uncomfortable thing for people to say who work in higher education studies. And the biggest threat, of course, to the incoming government is that students will take to the street and complain about them not being radical enough in their program. That is the nightmare. I hope it doesn't happen because it would be stupid. Chile needs to calm down a bit and to learn to love itself a bit at the moment. Yes, I mean, higher education, I don't think will be a high priority issue. And if the incoming government is accused of not doing enough for higher education, I think it will be uncomfortable for them, and they'll need to do quite a bit of horse whispering to fend off any accusations of that. It's not the highest priority issue that we've got at the moment, unfortunately. Now, Gonzalo's question is a classic one. Of course, in Chile, we have state-subsidized universities as well as state universities. These are called G9. I don't know what the G stands for in G9, but it sounds a bit like, I think it's in Australia, I think there's the group of 8, which is sometimes called GO8, and I think it's a tribute to Australia. You'd be pleased to know, Simon. And the G9 presents itself as relatively research-intensive universities. Originally, they actually excluded 4 of the smaller non-state, state-subsidized universities from their group. Then they expanded to 9. We've recently had 3 new non-state universities join the state-subsidized status, which is called the Council of Rectors. 3 quite diverse universities. One Jesuit one, it's quite a radical one, and also an Opus Dei one, socially conservative, and also one associated with the 1990s kind of centrist government movement named after Diego Portales. And this sector does see itself as public, as do the other universities, which are often plainly called private or new private universities, such as mine. They'll do a lot of what we call in quality assurance linkages with the midst, linkages with the context, ways of demonstrating how they're adding value to wider society, how they're public. Essentially, that's an important part of Chilean universities in general. All Chilean universities claim to be public. Now, the G9 group, so that's the universities such as the Catholic University, the big Catholic University in Santiago, actually adopted the slogan, public universities, not state ones, when the idea of public education was really being raised enthusiastically 10 years ago. And in many ways, they can demonstrate that they have been publicly funded since 1927, during a military government wanted to get greater control over the universities. So they took over the finances in 1927, and the public-private sector now associates that with the origins of public. Another thing I'd say about the Catholic University is a very interesting university. It was founded out of a discomfort with what perceived anti-clericalism. There was actually a big theology department in Universidad de Chile, and as what we call the lay laws kicked in the 1870s, 1880s, so the movement of functions from the church to the state, basically conservative Catholics, they had a political party called the Conservative Party, wanted their own university, and they established their own university in 1888. Now, the interesting thing about that is in 1891, there was a major papal encyclical. What was it called? New Things. I don't want to say it in Latin in case I get it wrong. New Things, which was a new really social positioning of the church at the time. And the new Catholic University did not go with the Vatican's reforming line in 1890, which of course was a response to things like socialism and workers' unions and so on, and stayed quite conservative early on. And it took a long time to get into reforming mode. And it, certainly for the first few decades, it was a reasonably cloistered institution. Now, of course, it's a huge public contributor. They were involved in getting us vaccinated last year. We're very happy with the rector of the Catholic University. Sorry, I went on too long, Simon.
Oh, Pete, that's fine. I think we're finished though, and thanks very much for coming. You've had praise heaped on you by Lisa Lucas and Christina de Cavallo, Laurie Lee Wallace in the chat, amongst others, and saying what a good talk it was, and good discussion as well. So keep us in mind when you develop papers in the future, and you're welcome to come back again, with or without Jose. Always good to have you both, but always good to have you individually as well. Now, next webinar, folks, is on Tuesday next week, Tuesday the 15th of March, and we have Marek. Marek Quick is back. Marek seems to cycle through every 6 months or so with a new paper. He's very productive and does work which a lot of people are reading. And he's going to talk to us about the role of big data in analysing the academic profession globally. So that will be methodologically and conceptually an interesting presentation. Marek Quick, next Tuesday. Pete, thanks again for your really interesting and vivid presentation on Chile. Great to have the history. Absolutely right, I think, to focus on the tradition and the history. These things really matter, and they do shape our present and our future. And our agency indeed can do new things and different things at any given time, but our agency is also, of course, incubated in these traditions. Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for participating, and bye for now.
Many thanks. Thank you for coming. Thank you.